Good evening. It's January 10th, 2025, and tonight's LaRouche Organization Symposium is going to take up a very important topic, which is the question of the nationalization of the Federal Reserve. Why should it be done? How do you do it? This is very important because one of the greatest vulnerabilities of the incoming Trump administration is that there is not one among them who has any clear understanding of the science of physical economy as Lyndon LaRouche did. Now, Lyndon LaRouche, of course, was extraordinary. He didn't make an error in his economic forecasting, and he had an approach very much based on physical science, not monetary theory. But I have two guests tonight who are going to be discussing this, and it would be very, very important for those of you, which I hope is everyone, who want to make the incoming administration successful, not only at ending perpetual war and genocide, but in lifting the United States and other nations out of the abject poverty and misery that most people in the West are facing. Would seek to understand this and pay close attention. So I'm going to just share with you something from one of LaRouche's program books. This was from his 2000 presidential campaign. It's called The Road to Recovery. It's a phenomenal book, I just have to say. And there's a chapter called Tariffs and Regulation, where he talks about his triple curve function, and he makes 2 points. One, in its recent and present state, the globalized financial system's continued existence depends not on operating profits from already accelerating collapse in production of real wealth, but upon financial capital gains generated through increased leveraging of monetary flows into the financial system. These capital gains, even wishfully anticipated capital gains, as for the case of the lunatic skyrocketing of pieces of worthless internet stocks, are the principal source of financial profit in the system as a whole, and the basis for leveraging of the continued expansion of financial aggregates. In short, the financial system as a whole represents chiefly a financial bubble of the John Law type. Once the bubble ceases to bloat, it implodes. Pop goes the weasel. Point number two, the expansion of the monetary aggregates at rates needed to forestall collapse of the financial bubble requires a flow of payments into the monetary institutions, feeding the financial bubble's leveraged growth. Since the real economy as a whole is operating at a net loss on physical economic account, the increased rate of payments needed to sustain the monetary expansion is obtained only by cannibalistic methods. Think of the congestion pricing we now have in New York City, for example. Austerity methods against the real economy. This results, in turn, in an accelerating contraction of the real economy. So not only is our economy not based on anything physical or production, but the more that we try to fuel this bubble, we are actually cannibalizing those things that generate wealth, that generate prosperity. So we are going to go shortly to my first guest, Paul Gallagher, who is on the editorial board of Executive Intelligence Review magazine, and also, as I had mentioned, but I think it's very significant, is a former political prisoner and longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche. So, Paul, welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium. And why don't
Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Well, I have an article in the magazine, this weekly magazine that comes out today, Executive Intelligence Review, on why the Congress and the new administration should nationalize the Federal Reserve. Fundamentally, the question is debt, generation of endless waves of new debt, eventually unpayable debt, as opposed to credit, the lending that banks do and that central banks should do, the lending of funds for specific productive projects, infrastructure projects, scientific breakthroughs, and others, projects which increase the productivity in general of the economy of the United States, and by participation, increase the productivity of many nations around the world. I could start by, and I do start the article by citing a quote that didn't get too much noticed, or at least not too much reported, from President-elect Trump in a press conference on December 16th, in which he said, "You know, the United States and China together could solve all of the problems of the world. Think about it." So if we think about that, we obviously come immediately to the necessity that the United States have a national lending bank that is a central bank of the nation whose function is to lend productively to agencies of the government which are engaged in major projects such as housing development for areas of housing shortages, for water management development, for railroad development, of which we in this country have no high-speed railroads at all, for power development, electric power development. We're very close to beginning to run below the levels of power reserve in a number of regions in this country, and similar major projects that agencies carry out. And that bank needs to help other banks, private banks, lend to construction, engineering, productive companies by participating in those loans, discounting them if you wish to use that term, but participating in those loans as well. We have a central bank which does none of those things as a matter of policy. And in fact, when challenged, it will state the policy that it does not lend to agencies engaged in any kind of infrastructure development. It does not lend even to municipalities, states and cities in the United States. And in addition, it creates funds, it creates money for purposes of speculation by the largest and through the largest private banks in the economy. And that's what it does. The United States Central Bank is called the Federal Reserve Bank. There are only a few other central banks in the world which have the name Reserve Bank in them. You'll see a pattern. One of them is the Reserve Bank of India. Another is the Reserve Bank of Australia. Another is the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. A fourth is the South African Reserve Bank. And then there is the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. The pattern is clearly one of former British colonies which have inherited a form of central bank which was used by the British Imperial, the British Empire in its colonies. What a reserve bank does, and again, if we look at what should the central bank of a nation, of a productive nation, a great economic nation, what should it do? Should it be buying directly the debt issued by the Treasury of that country? Certainly not. check that off as one thing the Federal Reserve does, in effect, all the time and in large volumes? Should it be targeting a rate of inflation by setting interest rates, something that the Federal Reserve began to fail to do? That is, its attempts to do that already were failing in the fatal 1970s, when a really strong and apparently unbeatable inflation broke out, which was only eventually ended at the end of the decade, 81, by a deep, deep recession brought on directly by the Federal Reserve. Should it play those kinds of games? Obviously, those are ineffective. Should it be trying to stimulate employment? Should it be fiddling around with very short-term interest rates that are loaned among banks overnight, in effect, and by doing so, trying to affect the rates of mortgage loans, the rates of business loans, which clearly does not work? We see right now that the Federal Reserve, since September, has lowered those very short-term rates by a full percentage point. And during the same 3 months, the longer-term rates went up by more than a percentage point each. The 10-year Treasury rate on which mortgages tend to be based, and the 5-year Treasury rate on which many business loans are based, were going up in the opposite direction. The central bank does not do any of those things effectively. What it could be extraordinarily effective at doing is lending on a large scale into what is necessary internationally, at least low single-digit trillion dollars in loans each year for the most transformative development projects, including a few in our nation, but the most transformative development projects around the world. And there is nothing that it could better do and with greater effect than if it did them, as the president was implying on December 16th in that press conference, if it was the United States and China together, as he said, they could solve all the problems of the world. Well, they could certainly solve this one problem that the Federal Reserve has otherwise helped to create. And that is the problem, especially in the last 5 years. And that is the problem of an unbearable burden of debt and lack of availability of credit for development in so many of the major developing countries around the world. I could just quote that the Foreign Affairs magazine, this is just one of many, but it is a very prestigious magazine, July 11th, 2024, in an article in Foreign Affairs, quote, "When the Federal Reserve raised interest rates on U.S. Treasury securities in March of 2022, low-income countries' currencies declined in value and their governments lost access to capital markets." That is a deadly situation for those developing countries, one which has led now to a situation which is reported as follows. If you take all of the developing countries in the world, the low-income ones, the medium-income ones, the ones which are verging on being developed countries, for example, like Indonesia, which joined the BRICS today, if you take all of those countries together, all of the debt that they currently are paying debt service on, as opposed to their government revenues, they are paying on average 42% of their total government revenues to service their debt. That's every year. The United States, by comparison, is paying approximately 16%, 1/6 of its government revenues to service its debt, even though that debt is exploding. The explosion has gone much, much further with the developing nations, to the point where they pay almost 3 times the share. 42% of all of their income revenue goes into simply paying the debt service on their on their external debts. And that means that it's far more than they're able to spend on the development of healthcare systems, far more than they can spend on education, on any kind of development. They have to keep servicing that debt, which is at a higher and higher interest rates, far above the interest rates that the Federal Reserve has driven up, where it went up to 5 suddenly in a year, from 0 to 5.25%. These countries are paying far, far higher rates than that because of the depreciation of their currencies. In response to what the Federal Reserve has done, it has been a wrecking ball, not an agency to solve any problems of the world by the United States and China together, but rather as a wrecking ball to create these problems. And it has directly, and I'm not going to go into detail to begin because we want to have some discussion here. It has helped to create those destructive problems directly, and especially since 2019, with the debt burden, which it has created with this interest rate spike that it implemented, and also with the beginning in the middle of 2019, in September of 2019, with what was called quantitative easing 5, and then in March of 2020, colloquially called quantitative easing infinite, which set the United States on the road to issuing $6 trillion in new Treasury debt since then. Now, this is a period of less than 4 years. $6 trillion in new Treasury debt in that period of time, and $5 trillion in additional creation of money by the Federal Reserve itself during that same period of time. And that has set us on the road to the current $36 trillion and rising US debt, which is increasing by something on the order of 6 to 7% every year. It has also increased the global indebtedness on the order of from $210 trillion approximately a decade or so ago to now, I believe, at the end of 2014, it will be found to be at $335 trillion and growing at between 5 and 6% a year. Now, what country other than China do we know of that has consistently grown at either 5 to 6 or 6 to 7% at any time in the last 10 to 15 years, matching that rate of global debt increase, and certainly not matching that rate of US federal debt increase? Most certainly the United States has been unable to grow at more than 2 to 2.1% during that period of time, just about 1/3 of the rate at which the Federal Reserve's debt bubble was growing. So just to sum it up, as an opener in this discussion, what a reserve bank does is it creates new excess reserves and deposits them, in effect, in the few largest banks that are headquartered in the nation. In our case, the half dozen or so largest Wall Street banks and a very few others receive excess reserves from the Federal Reserve, which creates them essentially out of nothing, and deposits them with those as electronic reserves with those banks. What is the basic idea of that? It's that those banks will then be in a position to provide enough liquidity in the middle of a crash, a financial crash, to provide enough liquidity to all the other banks and hedge funds and mutual funds and so forth in the banking system, in the financial system, in order to somehow ride the financial system through a crash. While the rest of the economy goes to hell, the bank somehow will continue to float on all of those excess reserves. That's what a reserve bank is created to do. A national bank, which is what we propose and detail in this article, a national bank its fundamental purpose is to lend productively to productive agencies, organizing missions of new frontiers and new production, and to participate in lending of private banks to business which are constructing those same projects. That is a fundamental difference, and that's the one we want to bridge by nationalizing the Federal Reserve.
Great. Thanks very much. All of this time it's called the Federal Reserve, and I had never thought about what the reserve idea of it was.
The colonial reserve.
Yeah, that's really something. So I'm going to bring up Richard Freeman, who also is a longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche and is an author of many special reports and articles, also for Executive Intelligence Review. So, Rich, welcome this evening, and why don't you go ahead?
Great. It's wonderful to be here. What I'd like to do is to basically emphasize three ideas. The United States has had two national banks. I'm going to show them at least on the screen, though we won't go into depth. It has had a legal tender called the Greenback under Abraham Lincoln, and it had a Reconstruction Finance Corporation under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. They all worked, and they all came from the same conception. Now, someone may say, well, why do they have different names, and were they exactly the same? They were not exactly the same in every particular, but they were exactly the same in the principle. And I would like to establish three principles. One is that what you do is credit goes from a national agency for productive purposes: agriculture, manufacturing, construction, transportation, energy generation, and for useful purposes, essential useful purposes, such as education, such as health. That's where the credit goes. You can handle other questions outside of that. Housing is one that you can put sort of in both areas. And that it has nothing to do with speculation, and that our purpose is to shut down that speculation. And what I'm going to further say, and I know Paul has the same, has written about this as well, is that we have to shut down the City of London and Wall Street. You cannot have two financial systems. As Abraham Lincoln said, you cannot have two houses, one slave and one free. And the slave will never let you have the free one. And that's through the Glass-Steagall. And the second feature I want to do is I'm going to talk about the credo, what the credo means, really. And the third is I'd just like to show a little bit of how the lending would actually occur with arrows and showing how this would work, not for the purposes of detail, but to give our viewers and our organizers a concrete sense of what we would do. So I'm going to do some of this quickly. We can come back to it. But I'd like to touch on these three ideas, all of which are governed by Lyndon LaRouche's conception of potential relative population density, which does not mean how many people you can stack on top of each other upon a square meter or square mile, but it means how do you support through the creative mind of man the development of the highest levels of what we call free energy or anti-entropic growth, such that the quality of man through each cycle of production is higher, such that the potential of the fertility or the productiveness of the whole economy has changed as a whole, not individual factory by factory, so that we end up at another manifold of development. This is possibly the most important conception that has been developed, in my limited view, in I would say in the last 500 years of thinking of people. So if we could start with a couple of these slides, as I said, we'll go through them, some of them rather quickly, but this is the first national bank of the United States. It's based in Philadelphia. It ran for a 20-year charter, 1791 through 1811. The next person who you will see, Alexander Hamilton, is the individual who, that's Lynn, okay, that's Hamilton. He created the conceptions of this. Paul may have more to say about this. I will only touch on 3 points. We were in an absolute anarchistic breakdown called the Articles of Confederation. And what Hamilton did is he said, we're going to create a bank, we're going to direct credit. The credit will be directed towards principally infrastructure and the discounting of loans that will be from commerce, but from productive side of things, as I previously said. It allowed the state debts to be turned into a national blessing by buying stock of the First National Bank. 20% of the First National Bank stock was owned by the government. The other 80% were owned by the population. Some of them were foreigners. People were afraid of that. But what happened is they had no voting stock whatsoever. So that's number one. And they had to buy bonds paying 6.5% to purchase stock, which meant they had to buy the U.S. government debt, but debt for the productive purposes of issuing of directed credit. This bank did fairly well. It created a whole debate within the administration, which I will not touch on right now. But I want to make one point. You cannot take the First National Bank of Hamilton, or it was called the Bank of the United States, but we've had a few banks of the United States, so it got recalled colloquially the First National Bank, as outside the creation of the country or the Constitution. Hamilton is the principal writer of the Constitution, not James Madison. He wrote most of the Federalist Papers. He wrote it so he could get the U.S. Constitution through New York State, where there was a real fight against the Tories, who way outnumbered the nationalists like Hamilton at the beginning, and he therefore produced the most profound ideas. He was the one who also was the adjutant to George Washington during the Revolutionary War. It was one process of nation building. You can't talk about it as simply what was this codicil in this clause? Doesn't work. It's an idea of principle to create a republic, the first that had ever existed on the face of the earth. Yes, we had Florence. Yes, we had Athens. These were city-states. They were flawed. This was the first time you had one for a whole nation. It was taking up one of the most profound ideas that could ever exist. And it was in that process that he understood you had to have a directed credit. That's all I'm going to say right now. There's much more that can be said. Next, please. This is Nicholas Biddle. He was not the only, but he was the longest serving and the best president of the Second National Bank. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Paul and I were discussing a book about him, which both of us, I certainly want to dig into more to get how the Second National Bank functioned. But this was from 1816 to 1836. Some people may remember that racist Indian killer named Andrew Jackson, who had a few features that he actually did decently, but not many, destroyed the bank in 1833 by removing government deposits from the bank as a operation under Van Buren, who was became president and who was the controller from Wall Street of those who wanted to destroy what they called the monster bank. It was anything but a monster bank. Next, please. Now, this is a person I just want to say something about because most people have never heard of him. There are a few people, such as Paul. Elbridge Spaulding. He wrote the Greenback Act, what's called the Legal Tender Act. What people don't know about him is that he was a thoroughgoing Lincoln Republican. He became the mayor of Buffalo. He's passed the Harbors Act to clear up the harbors of Buffalo to get shipping. He established a sewer system in Buffalo, one of the first in the nation. He built the Buffalo Gas Light Company, and he helped develop the upper part of New York State. He also was a person who went to the Republican convention. He helped form the leadership of the Republican convention, which the Republican Executive Congressional Committee, which promoted the election of Abraham Lincoln. He introduced the Legal Tender Act on he introduced it into the House on December 30th, 1861. The significance of that is 2 days before, the United States has been based on gold. The coins of gold were called specie. And we went off the specie system, or the major banks in New York went off the specie system as a way of basically trying to bankrupt the economy on the eve of a great war, with a question of not only slavery, but whether we would have a nation and whether it would long endure. So he introduces this proposal, and the first issuance of $150 million was done in the first Legal Tender Act. Now, what legal tender means is that you had a currency which was not backed by gold, and it was issued for payment to soldiers and for supplies in war. It could be spent for payment of any debt, and what it did is it allowed the circulation of money. There were 3 legal tender acts, all of $150 million each, for a total of $450 million. Before this, the United States had only $200 million in banknotes. After the 3 legal tender acts, it went up to $650 million. So the circulating supply of currency, which also functioned as a form of credit also, we could go into that, tripled. And it was not just used for the war, but the war paid people like people who built machine tools, people who built bridges, people who built roads, people who built the clothing, which was mass manufactured for the first time in the United States to produce uniforms for the Civil War for the Union soldiers. And what you started to see is that there were economic problems, but the economy boomed. And I will just say that as a result of Spaulding, Lincoln, and a few others, the United States had a growth, a shockwave growth from 1861 through 1893. It was possibly the second greatest growth in the United States. During that period, the steel production increased from about 400,000 to 11 million tons. The railroads went from 53,000 miles in that period I've specified to 193,000 miles. And Lincoln, of course, did this through the building of national railroads and so forth. But what was the importance of this? This was issued as an emergency action, but it was issued through the Congress. The Treasury had to be responsible for issuing this currency. It was issued as a loan, but it was done for productive purposes. And the United States boomed. Now, some people, like Solomon Chase and others, said, well, this was only an emergency action for war. I will just say, again, this is very summary. Henry Carey didn't think so. He was America's greatest economist of that century, of that 19th century. He fought because the idea was to burn them, and that's what happened. They were all retired, 450 million, to produce a very, very restrictive gold standard called specie resumption. And Carey fought till the dying days of his life to keep these circulating because he realized they were not just a war measure. They were a measure that would make the economy grow because of the directed Hamiltonian nature. You don't throw them up in the air. You point them to what you want to have built. Next, please. If that's Lincoln, I think most people will recognize him. Next, please. And that's the 5 continental railroads. I won't go through all of them. The one in the middle, where you see the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific being joined, was the first one, which meets some promontory point. It wasn't started until after Lincoln died, but he put it into motion. Lots could be said about that because this took the trip for a young man who wanted to go, say, from Atchison all the way to San Francisco, 4 months. It took it down to 4.5 days. That built permanent productivity in the economy. There were many other things but just think of that as one transformation. Next, please. Just to make this. Now, that's the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It's the actual first act. You can't read it, but it says July 21st, 1932. It was passed under Hoover to bail out the banks and to bail out the railroads, which were the largest industrial firms in the United States that were collapsing. Did nothing of any good. Next, please. So, one step back. So what happened, I will only say that under the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Roosevelt turned it into the same thing as a national bank because he didn't have to go back to Congress to keep getting it renewed. It lent between 1933, when he took office March 4th, 1933, through 1945, it lent $33 billion. It lent more than all the commercial banks of the United States combined. Some people have said it, 50 billion, including the person who was chairman. I tried to just get the most accurate figure I could. It could have been bigger. I don't know. But the point was, it built small roads. It built railroads, electrified railroads. It built all sorts of tubing. It built, before the war, it built $9.5 billion worth of goods. Some of it did go to bail out the banks, but most of it was for the productive purpose. During the war, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation set up the War Loan Corporation. I'm getting the name wrong. And that financed not all of it, but a good portion of the effort of the war to build machine tool plants, steel plants, and so forth. Productive credit, the same principle as Lincoln, the same principle as Hamilton. Okay, let's bring it up to today again. I'm going to identify just a few of the things that we think could be done. So next, please. And these are projects, 5 of them. I've talked them over with Paul. We've talked about others. There's many more that could be done. This would be an electrified rail system of 42,000 miles. Instead of, we have an electrified railway system, if you want to be generous, of about 600 miles in the United States, counting part of Florida and parts around Boston. That's it. And this was developed principally by Hal Cooper, a very smart and person. I worked with him on some of this. Next, please. So that would be one area. A second is to bring water from Alaska, the Yukon and the Mackenzie rivers down into the lower 48 states, 48 states, and into Mexico. It's called North American Water Power Alliance. We could go into it, but it would be nuclearized in a very important way. But this will bring permanent productivity. It's inter-water basin, watershed, water movement of the exact same sort we do in Africa. Next, please. This is a nuclear power plant, and I want to use this for a purpose. This is just one in Arkansas. It's the Russellville, Arkansas nuclear power plant. I want to, next, please. Thanks, Diane, for all this. I just want to show you what goes into this, because this is going to be part of it, the last thing I say. Look at the number of pumps, 70 to 90, large ones, small ones, tanks, heat exchangers, compressors, fans, cranes and hoists, diesel generators, prefabricated equipment, valves, structural steel. Of course, you have to have containment vessels. I'm going to use this in a second. This is what will build. We need about 150 new nuclear power plants. Our fleet has been shrinking. But I'm going to use this for the example of how the credit goes. Next, please. This is Apollo 11. We need a space program. We need a major space program. We need to think about going out into space for 1,000 good reasons. Next, please. And this is a national ignition facility at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories, which has achieved some very impressive features of what would be needed for a fusion program. Itself is not a fusion program as such, but it's doing work that can be very valuable when combined with other. Those 5 areas would be something that would be of absolute importance. So that the nuclear, the high-speed rail, the space program, the fusion program, and the water management called NWAPA. Those could be each absorb at least $200 billion. Next, please. Now, I want to just end up with 2 things. The first is the word credo. And anyone who has sung in the chorus, and people may know that Diane is one of our directors, choral directors, knows that anytime you sing the Mass, you sing credo in unum Deum, and partum, and you go through it, and so forth. What is the word credo? Well, the word credo comes from the Latin word, probably butchered, Paul will probably correct me, credere, which is the same word. And what you're saying is, I believe, the first things, I believe in one God, credo in unum Deum, and so forth. You state, it's called, it's the creed, Nicene Creed, and you state your belief. It's a belief. Credere means belief. Credit means belief. Credit means belief? Yes, because you're stating your belief in the future. Is your future, worthless things like Bitcoin and so forth, speculation, slavery of trading people around, drugs and so forth? Or is your future a belief in the power of mankind around the world and the things that are needed to do it? When you lend credit, you're lending from the future to the present based on your vision of a future based on potential relative population density and the perfectibility of man. That's what credit is. People say, I want my credit based on hard stuff, gold, this, that. Forget it. The hard stuff is what you do with the economy and men's minds. Last, please. I hope I don't have time. Okay, so let me just say what's going to happen, because Lynn talks about it. So Lyndon LaRouche. This is if you had a national bank in the United States. It would extend credit to a commercial bank. Why? Well, let's take Westinghouse and say they want to build a nuclear reactor in the United States. The bank, we'll call it Commercial Bank A, would take the paper, the credit, the agreement to build this plant. Let's say it's a gigawatt plant. And it goes to the Bank of the United States and says, please lend some money to me. Under the system that LaRouche is conceiving of, the Bank of the United States would lend something like 40 or 50% of the value. So in other words, if the project was $1 billion, then it would be lent $400 to $500 million would be lent from the National Bank of the United States to the commercial bank. The commercial bank would come up with the other 50%. The Bank of the United States might lend at 2 to 3%. The commercial bank may lend at 4 to 5%. You would get a blended interest rate of somewhere in between, let's say 3 to 4%. The Bank of the United States is not interested in making money. It has to just service the ability to carry out its lending operations, pay for its staff, and so forth. So simple. Bank of the United States lends credit to a commercial bank. The commercial bank takes that credit after presenting papers that it will build. And you will have to have tranches showing you've accomplished a certain amount of work by each year to get your next tranche. Next, please. This last thing. I hope I haven't taken too much time. Now, this is what we're going to do if we had an international development bank. And I want to show you what it would be if we had Westinghouse Nuclear. So the Bank of the United States lends to a commercial bank, which lends to Westinghouse. But let's say we're building this for Malawi, or we're building this for Ecuador. We would create an international development bank. And I would say the Bank of the United States should be capitalized at 3 to 4 trillion, giving the ability to lend usually a multiple of 2 to 3 times. So somewhere around on the upper level, 6 to 9 trillion. But LaRouche proposed in 1975 that you would have an international development bank, replacing the IMF. It would also lend credit to Westinghouse. So now you have 2 sources of credit coming into Westinghouse, the National Bank of the United States through the commercial bank and the international bank. Now let's look at some of those things we said. This is my last point on what we saw has to go into a nuclear power plant: piping, heat exchangers, compressors. Westinghouse tells people, I'm placing an order with you for piping, for heat exchangers. You're going to build them. Well, they need money. Well, they get some from Westinghouse, but they have to go to the commercial banks. But what they can say to the commercial banks, why I want you to lend me some money to build structural steel, is because I have a guarantee from the Bank of the United States that it's going to fund Westinghouse. Oh, you've got that? And something from the International Development Bank. Oh, you've got that? We as a commercial bank will lend to you. So now you're getting the spreading effect of not just Westinghouse, but all the way. And the commercial banks will be loaded with what? With real assets, with real loans to productive sides of the economy through the National Bank of the United States and International Development Bank. We will write off through Glass-Steagall all the wasteful paper. And we will start rebuilding these banks. Their assets may be 1/10 to 1/5 of what they were, but they'll be real assets. So that's what I want to say. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm bringing us all up here. I thought now that you've said what you said about a national bank, if Paul could do a little bit of a recap about what it is that the Federal Reserve is actually doing, which it should not be doing, or what a national bank would not be doing?
And this will give people, I think, a very good idea of what I mean by the activity of a reserve bank and why you want to get rid of it. If you look at compare all the deposits in the banking system of the United States to all the loans, the loan credit outstanding from the banking system of the United States. If you look at December of 1997, you see that the deposits and the loans were essentially identical, 3.1 trillion and 3.05 trillion. That's not surprising because when banks are operating normally, they create most of the deposits by making loans. If a bank makes a loan to me, what it does is it creates an account in my name in that bank and it puts bank funds in it and thereby creates deposits in my name. So they go together. If you go 10 years later, December of 2007, the identity is still there. The deposits, 6.65 trillion. The loans, 6.80 trillion, virtually the same. Comparing these in the entire banking system. Then all of a sudden, of course, in 2007, 2008, there was a crash. The Federal Reserve began what people colloquially called printing money. With quantitative easing, it began shoveling excess reserves in electronic form into the banks. What did the banks were able to do with those? They were able to create deposits. So all of a sudden, in December 2016, now we've taken another 9-year jump, the deposits were now nearly 12 trillion, and the loans outstanding from the banking system only 9 trillion. So suddenly a nearly 3 trillion gap has opened up. Then we take another jump, and it's not nearly as long, it's just 5 years to December 2021. And we find that the deposits in the banking system are 18 trillion. That is, they're 3 times what they were 14 years earlier. The loans are 10.73 trillion. So the deposits in that 14-year period have grown by $11 trillion. The loans only by $4 trillion. That's where excess reserves go. The biggest banks get them, only the biggest banks get them from the Federal Reserve. They manifestly, after a crash, when they're saving themselves, when they're floating themselves in the banking system above a crash of the economy, they don't loan those reserves out. Rather, they use them in other ways, speculatively, within the banks themselves, within the biggest banks themselves. And that is where you get the direct connection between the function of the biggest reserve bank in the world, the Federal Reserve Bank, and the biggest banks in the world, at least outside China, the biggest speculating banks in the world, which are using the reserves that they get from the Fed in electronic form in order to conduct speculations of all kinds. And guess what? Set up the next crash at which the Federal Reserve will then have to multiply by 2 or 3 and give them 2 or 3 times as much in the form of excess reserves, which they will use for speculations beyond that. This is exactly what must end. And the first thing that is involved, and this is a metaphor essentially for what is the effect of the Federal Reserve and other of the largest central banks in the world, but they're definitely led by the Federal Reserve. No question about that. This is a microcosm here in the US banking system for what the Federal Reserve is doing to the debt versus the credit. If you think of these loans as being credit, and they're not all productive by any means, but they at least have a chance of being productive. If you think of the gap between credit and the tremendous volume of debt, unpayable debt, that has exploded since the crash of 2008, and especially since the crises that have hit the interbank system among the biggest banks since 2019. So what must be done to nationalizing the Federal Reserve is, first of all, Congress must act together with the president and write the Federal Reserve or the central bank a new charter. It must, in the process, remove the current management of the Federal Reserve, replace it with a management of people who know something from experience about engineering, construction, productive business in general. And it must forbid them from continuing, the new bank, the national bank, from continuing to create excess reserves in this way, which is colloquially called printing money, as I mentioned. It then is able to lend the currency, which may be created by the Treasury for purposes of lending only, not for purposes of just spreading and spending on anything, but for purposes of productive lending only. The bank can then lend that and make a multiple of the amount of revenue coming into the Treasury from taxes, fees, and similar sources. It can make a multiple of some of that revenue in order to have a capital budget. Essentially, such a national bank will give the United States a separate capital budget for precisely the kind of projects that Rich Freeman was showing during his presentation in the central part of it. And that capital budget will be able to multiply the amount of actual year-to-year revenue put into it because of the future increases in productivity, which these missions, these projects will bring about. That bank will lend to productive agencies of governments and to productive manufacturing and engineering companies. It will dump and by charter will not be allowed to continue to maintain its own large assets in the form of mortgage-backed securities. It's still holding 2.25 trillion as of right now in mortgage-backed securities as assets. Despite the so-called quantitative easing, it hasn't reduced that quantity at all. So those are derivatives. That's your central bank holding as its a large chunk of its assets what are nothing but derivatives, and derivatives based on other derivatives. They certainly are not doing any good, these mortgage-backed securities. The housing market of the United States right now is effectively frozen. The prices are skyrocketing upward while no one is buying any homes. So what are they holding these 2.25 trillion in mortgage-backed securities for? They should be compelled by the charter to get rid of such derivatives and never hold them again. They also should be required by regulation to lower their current holdings of U.S. Treasuries, which are still 4.5 trillion after 2.5 years of supposed quantitative tightening, still 4.5 trillion. They're holding 3 times as much, the Fed is, 3 times as much in treasuries as the entire U.S. private banking system is. Well, it's the private commercial banks that are supposed to buy and hold a large amount of treasuries. They're not doing it. The Federal Reserve is doing it. These things have to be ended in order to create the channel of productive lending. There's a lot more on this in the article that I wrote that comes out in EIR, came out in EIR today, Friday. But I'll leave it at that. I think this chart makes it very, very clear what the difference is.
Great. Rich, thoughts?
Yeah, 2 thoughts. One is that I showed how the International Development Bank would work in the United States. I mean, you would get 2 sources of credit. You would get the source from the Federal Reserve, National Bank of the United States, and if it was an export, from the International Development Bank, which would those are the types of supports. That's what we mean by dirigism. You're not telling people what they have to produce, but you draw up a list through engineers and through people who are competent from examining what exists in your country, but examining what we've been looking at, and Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been looking at, and Lyndon LaRouche looked at in Earth's next 50 years. What do we need to develop? What are the water systems, the power systems, the electricity systems? What are the different types of factories? What are the capital goods? Most countries don't have machine tools. They don't have a railroad, or they have a limited railroad, some of them. These are the sorts of things that can be built. You would have an international development bank make that lending. There would be no strings attached. You'd have to have performance contracts, but there would be no conditionalities and so forth. And they would also have their own national banks. So that would do two things. You would change our relationship to the developing world, because the other side I didn't go into is what America could export. We want to end the migration from Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala, the Northern Triangle. We have plans that could actually develop them. You want to wipe out the drug gangs, just don't line them up and sit them in the middle of a square. Build everything that we know needs to be built there, and you will shut off the drugs, and you will have people not wanting to leave their country. They'll be excited to see what was their country 10 years ago and where they can become in 10 years from now. And this is the reason people become patriots in the good sense of their country. They want to raise their children there. They want to develop as contributors to the world. The other thing that this will do is I don't think repurposing the International Monetary Fund will occur. We might be able to, as we're saying, nationalize the Federal Reserve if we have the concept of a national bank. But we would wipe off a lot of the debt. This is the year of the Jubilee. We would do exactly what they did in Ecuador 20 years ago, which we will have in our publications, where they figured out that less than 10% of all the debt that Ecuador had incurred internationally was legitimate, and only keep that amount that was legitimate and pay that off. We would do this for every country. I would suggest, and we don't have a figure on this, so I don't want to suggest this for the LaRouche organization or for the Schiller Institute, but just looking at the massive needs in the developing sector, we're probably talking about a bank that needs to be capitalized at somewhere between 5 and 10 trillion, so that if it lends 2 to 3 times that, it can lend somewhere, let's take 15 to 30 trillion. The needs are just so great. Remember, credit is not inflationary. If you invest in things which transform in a revolutionary way science and nature, you make things cheaper. If you make things less expensive. Just think of the simplest thing about what happened to the computer and what we're able to put on a single chip, which you couldn't put onto a computer, an IBM computer that occupied 2 rooms back 40 years ago. Is that more expensive or less? If you issue credit X, but can produce product Y, which is greater the amount of credit that you issued, then it's deflationary in a good sense. So those are some of the principles. And the last thing I would just raise, and you, Diane, or Paul may have more to say on this, we have to put Glass-Steagall into effect. Glass-Steagall is not just dividing a bank into a commercial bank and into an investment bank. That's not it. You can do that. It wouldn't change anything. You have to write off the paper. You have to change power. We have to change power in New York and London. We have to break their power once and for all. It was not done after World War II. It was not done at other times, so that we can then go ahead and put in an international development bank, which is genuinely for the purposes coinciding with the work of the BRICS that it's intended for.
Just what you're saying reminds me of something else, and Paul may have other things, but the whole question of profit, right? Because if things are in the hands of just private commercial interest owned by a particular individual, the individual is interested in making a profit. Now, it seems that the government absolutely could regulate such things and say that you're not entitled to make more than X percent profit, but also one of you had said earlier, the point is not for the government to make profit. What would the government, the profit of the government is actually the well-being of the American people. That's the type of profit that a government should be striving for. And hopefully people will come in and out of the government and not be there for centuries until they're sitting around in diapers and freezing in strokes while they're speaking places. But
that's only true for presidents. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, we have a number of senators. We've seen them, Mitch McConnell and others. They suddenly, stop. Nancy Pelosi gets down on her knee and can't get up again and breaks her hip wearing 15-inch stiletto heels. I mean, these people are crazy. But, it seems like the whole thing is not right. It's all out of kilter. We're seeking after something which really shouldn't be in the interest if we were thinking about our immortality as opposed to some short-term game. But Paul, go ahead.
Well, one way of answering that question of profit, to think of it in terms of benefit or the profit of a nation, I started out by quoting Trump rather speculatively, and I'm not sure how much he was putting his mind totally into it, but he said that the United States and China together can solve the problems of the world. Think about it, he said. So I've been thinking about it. Now, he obviously is always comparing China to the United States with a certain competitive passion, let's say. So let's compare the profit. During the period, essentially since the crash of 2007 and 8, taking the period beginning in 2009 and going up till the Fed really began to go haywire in 2019. But taking that decade there, the lending became credit internationally for developing countries became harder to get. Despite the fact that everybody was saying during that period of time, my God, the interest rates are zero. Why aren't we borrowing, trillions and trillions of dollars? Well, there were reasons why you didn't get to borrow trillions and trillions. And if you take...
I was actually hoping to get paid for borrowing. I like those negative interest rates.
The World Bank loaned in total for development $47 billion in 2009, $45 billion in 2019, a decade later, and loaned $475 billion total over that decade. China, one of its banks, the China Development Bank, loaned $230 billion over that period alone, half as much as the World Bank. China's 5 major policy banks together loaned 900 billion plus, 900 billion plus during that same period of time to developing countries through the Belt and Road Initiative and through the period up through the end of 2019. What did China get out of that for itself? An average rate of growth, economic growth during that period of 8.8% per year. The United States, by comparison, had nothing but the United States International, what is it called? The United States International Development Finance Corporation, with a capital of only $60 billion permitted. So nothing on this, remotely on this scale, while China was outlending the World Bank. year after year. What China got out of it was 8.8% growth every year. What the United States got out of it was an average of 2% growth every year during that same period of time. So who profited by all that lending, or which nation gained the profit in the form of the development of its capital goods and the development of its scientific capabilities and its technologies, and just the raw income of its exports and the amount of money that it had to invest domestically then in producing what's now nearly 50,000 kilometers of high-speed, nearly 50,000 miles of high-speed rail. Kilometers is right.
Kilometers.
46,000 kilometers of high-speed rail domestically at the same time. That's what China got in that period when, from the perspective of someone as competitive as the president-elect, there was a competition going on to see who would benefit the most from benefiting others, who would profit the most from giving benefit to other countries. And clearly, China won that competition by giving benefit to other countries in the form of that $900 billion in lending just in that decade. So if we do it together, as he made that one suggestion, we may not be able to solve all of the problems of the world, but we can certainly solve the problem of the lack of credit for development and production worldwide, which is currently sitting on the developing countries like an immense and incredibly heavy burden, and is unpayable. So let's do that, Glass-Steagall. It's necessary to nationalize. If you're going to nationalize the Federal Reserve, that's going to be necessary. Otherwise, all those banks will simply go under, those Wall Street banks. Richard,
I was just saying,
see you're smiling, so.
yeah, well, who profits and not and loses the world? I think the question is, I'm for profit. I think the entrepreneur system is a very good system. It really does work. We had it. The shops, they're anywhere from businesses from 10 to 50 to 100 to 300, where the family works. It takes pride in what it does. It's its reputation. The children who take over the firm are not thinking of, they're thinking of that it has to be as good as possible, and they want to make as much as scientific advance as they can as possible. That really is, that's not free enterprise. It has zero to do with free enterprise. It is, however, a very good system. The thing about it is you measure your profit ultimately by the well-being of the population, has to be, by doing good. But it's also, what have you transformed physically so that you can say, I have built something that's very good. I have made some money from that. That's a real profit. The largest part of GDP, it's between 21 and 22%, is what's called FIRE, finance, insurance, and real estate. So 1/5 of everything that goes on in the country is that. Okay, when you take your profit, and Lyndon LaRouche called this a social profit, and you take and you maintain all the things that you have to, and the part of the population that doesn't produce, but you want to maintain, like teachers, doctors, firemen, and a whole range of things. But you have a social surplus of free energy. And if you invest that part of the profit intelligently, you will get a higher rate of free energy the next sector, and you will have even more to then invest to get even a higher rate of free energy. And it will keep growing even as you increase living standards. People consume more, of better quality, of higher cultural value. Machine tools are better. They're more intense, and yet you'll be producing greater and greater levels of profit. That correlates with anti-entropy. That's good. And I think it's how you develop that outlook. The funny thing about it is, and we've talked about this, you and I, Diane, and Paul over dinner and elsewhere. I mean, things look so terrible, but this thing can be snapped, not just through the bricks. The hold that this has, this evil, degenerate culture, it's very bad, but it also can be snapped. And it can be snapped in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. And that's when you can do that and slice through everything, because things are not functioning, as Paul's showing, and on a fundamental level. I mean, things are just breaking down all over the place. We have rates of decline. It's at that point when people see, which they don't like to look at, because they'd rather tune into the football game or other stupid stuff. But when they see that their family's life is dissolving in front of them, and there's a breakdown like 2007 through 2009, and there's nothing being done by the authorities, in a twinkling of an eye, we can turn this around and introduce the most profound ideas. It's not Pollyannish. And that's where if we do good for the developing sector, if we really want to turn the lives of those people in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, we will get rid of the drug trade. That won't be the first reason we do it, but it'll, of course, be the reason that will come out of it. And if people can think like that, they can actually think in terms of economics, real economics, not supply, demand, or stuff for first graders.
Right. Well, people value the wrong things. And I'm just thinking now of the beginning of this chapter. Lynn has a whole discussion, I don't know if I can find it right away, on consumerism, because this is kind of a crazy idea. What do people delight in? There's obsessions with having things or fantasizing about having things, wandering around shopping malls or surfing on the web on Amazon or eBay, right? Not thinking about what you can produce or discover. And he says this, the consumerist is comparable to the case of the drug addict who was hauled into the hospital just yesterday, dead on arrival. The consumerist's lustful adoration of his own petty cupidity impels him to return again and again, more and more, to his self-destructive habit. That consumer should remind us of the way in which, according to British sources, the Malay farmer was accustomed to catching monkeys with a devilishly simple device called the Malay monkey trap. The trap was a jar with a narrow neck. The jar was fastened to a post or a tree and a nut placed within the jar. The nut selected was just small enough to fit, but only barely through the neck of the jar. The greedy monkey finds the nut, reaches his paw through the neck to clutch the desired nut within. Since he refuses to relinquish his grip on the nut, he cannot remove his paw from the jar. He refuses to relinquish the grip on that nut. The farmer's family ate the monkey that night.
The monkey should have turned the jar upside down. That's what we're proposing to do with the Federal Reserve. Turn it upside down.
Exactly. Go ahead. That's great.
Well, that's all there is on that. Well, that's drawn my dog into the room here. This thing about monkeys and nuts. But I should just point out that on this question of lending and whether it may be very difficult to do this, Richard did research, I think uniquely, that went into a special report back in 2003, 23 years ago, that showed that during the period in which he was describing the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, although that did not become the central bank of the United States, it loaned a great deal more, it put out a great deal more credit than the Federal Reserve did. Year after year, he may still have the figures at the top of his head, I don't know. But in effect, that Reconstruction Finance Corporation did become the central bank of the United States in a real sense of the way that a national bank must work. We do not live in a universe in which central banks like the Federal Reserve are the only kind that you can have, or the only kind that are big enough to be the central bank of the United States. The RFC did that, and it did that by lending in every productive direction, taking chances in many cases, informed chances, but nonetheless taking chances on capital investments in either companies or even private banks, which were struggling, and taking long-term chances with patient capital into those institutions and in those companies. And what it did in bringing us out of the Depression and helping to win World War II, I don't have to go through here, but it did show that a bank of this kind, a lender of this kind, if pursued, will become the dominant central financial institution of the nation.
Right. I think it's
I'm still trying to get that republished into EIR. I'll just put in a little editorial.
Okay.
I think it would be appropriate.
All right, thanks. Well, my favorite image out of this program is the monkey and the jar getting turned upside down, dumping out that nut. Save the monkeys. Save the monkeys from their own consumerism. Lynn goes on in that to say that it's not a far stretch to go from consumerism to astrology and horoscopes and fetishes of all kinds of crazy things that have nothing to do with reality. But I think this has been an extremely important discussion. I would encourage people to share this far and wide. And the paper that's coming out in this week's, or has just come out, it just came out on January 7th, of the Executive Intelligence Review. It's there. You can find it at larouchepub.com, EIR.news. I would encourage people to subscribe to that as well and to contribute to the LaRouche organization. So thank you both.
Just to correct that for a minute, if in case anyone's writing it down, it's a little confusing because of when we're taping this and when it's going to be on. But the date is of the issue is actually January 10th.
It is. Okay.
That's Friday. The appearance of the issue will be January 9th. That's Thursday.
Yesterday.
Right. Yes. Yesterday, if we were really on Friday. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Let's not monkey around with these things.
Yeah, the monkey just got lost.
Right. All right. Very good. So thank you both for joining me.
Thanks, Diane.
Thanks for having us.